Okay, so that's the first two. The second element which Christensen and Rayner have talked about is they also recognize that what we're trying to do with disruption is to identify so-called non-consumption. Okay? We're trying to find markets and customer segments that we can serve without competing head-on with what's already out there. So in Kim and Moore Burns' book, when they talk about blue and red ocean strategies, a blue ocean strategy would be where we are competing against non-consumption. In other words, there's no existing competitors in that space. We are actually moving in this direction, or we're moving into this space, or possibly into that space, but most likely we're moving towards non-consumption, which is away from our existing measurement. And I'll elaborate a little bit on this in a moment. But the whole notion of blue ocean strategy is to try and find the least expensive way of competing. And of course, the flip side of that is the most expensive way of competing is to compete head-on with other competitors. So can we find a configuration where there's not consumption going on because the products are too complex, because they're inaccessible to customers, or because they're too expensive? And you can think of loads of examples that fit that bill. Okay. By the way, just going back to this phone for a second, one of the beauties about creating a disruptive product of this type is that this phone costs significantly less than a smartphone to manufacture, but they can actually charge a premium relative to its cost of manufacture because of the fact that they have taken so much functionality out of it. There's no camera, for example, in here. I'm sure you could get one with a camera, but in this particular one, there's no camera, there's none of all of that kind of functionality. Okay, so let's look at the next step. Christensen and Rayner were confronted by Andy Grove at the time that he was the chief executive of Intel, and he said he felt that when Christensen was talking about this theory of disruption, he talked mostly about technological disruption. He talked about hydraulics replacing steam-driven shovels on quarries, for example, or he talked about the steel industry where integrated mills were disrupted by mini mills, and those are the examples that he cites from his research. All really fantastic examples, but mostly sort of revolving around technology. And what Andy Grove said was, he said, so what about the iPod, for example? How does that work? Because it doesn't fit this notion of simpler, more accessible, and cheaper. I mean, the iPod, when it was introduced, was definitely not cheaper than a Sony Walkman, for example. And what they recognized at that point was actually there was another set of curves. Or if I was to put customer satisfaction metrics number 1, I could put customer satisfaction metrics here number 2, and you notice that these performance metrics and those performance metrics are entirely different. And I can create another set of curves which kind of mirror all of this. And the move from this set of curves to this set of curves isn't about the technological shift. It's actually much more to do with a shift in the business model. So the next kind of wave of disruption that was identified was the business model disruption that happened. And the argument goes that if you go back to the Apple example of the iPod, that actually the disruption itself was to do with iTunes, not to do with the iPod. So iTunes was the business model, the kind of service wraparound of the iPod, and that was what made the difference between these two things. Now, how is that the case? Well, the notion is that to comply with being disruptive, it would have to be simpler, it would have to be more accessible, and would have to be cheaper. And you could say that actually if you added up the number of songs that would previously have been on a long playing record, for example, or on a CD, it would cost more than in my era, for example, I would have expected to pay. But actually teenagers were downloading these things and buying one song at a time, and they were paying 79 pence in the UK or 99 cents in the US. And for that reason, actually it became cheaper and more accessible because they could download it without leaving home, didn't have to get to a record store as was the case in the previous incarnation of the product. So it was more accessible, it was simpler, and it was cheaper. And so this was kind of the first wave past technology as a disruption. It moved us down the curve of non-consumption. Teenagers now could actually access it. So previously they weren't consuming the product. Now they were consuming the product, and they were consuming them at a higher rate. And actually, if you look at the performance of iTunes, actually iTunes and the App Store, which is kind of the next generation, has outstripped the revenues from the iPod by some stretch, and a lot faster. And then the last piece of the puzzle in terms of waves of innovation disruption is also moving away in terms of towards non-consumption, but it's to do with this whole notion of digital disruption. So we have another set of curves, and this also possibly has its own set of customer satisfaction metrics, performance requirements, and so on. But digital disruption is interesting for another reason, and I just want to play this back to you quickly, and that is that digital disruption is about the movement into a set of related disruptions, which the guys at IBM, for example, would talk about as being CAMs. So it's cloud, analytics, mobile, and social, and all of these various different trends are changing the way in which data is generated and the way in which data is consumed and configured, etc. And it is a significant change. And when we talk about the Watson computer and the shift from a computer that can learn to a computer that can reason, in amongst all of that is also this whole notion about what's happening with data. So in other words, the digitization of the planet. If you now start adding all of the stuff that comes on a standard smartphone, for example, Siri, so you can talk to it, it has voice recognition, it has retina recognition, it has sensors that can tell an orientation in terms of which way up it is, and you start adding the sensors that are added to products all over the world in all sorts of different circumstances. The exponential growth of data and all that means in terms of cloud, analytics, mobile, and social is an astronomical disruption, the outcome of which is not yet clear. So people are investing, so IBM being the great example. They're investing in trying to understand it. They are recruiting PhDs and other specialists who have a capability to be able to try and view what the future might look like around that. But in essence, it represents a disruption. And by the way, this is beautifully written up without the reference to the Watson computer, but it's beautifully written up by a guy called James McQuivey, who wrote a book called Digital Disruption, which I would highly recommend to you. It's a 2013 book, I think. All right, so there we have it. We have, let's call it disruption A, technological, disruption B, business model, disruption C, digital. Now, the disruption C, the digital disruption is, I think you could make the mistake. In this particular case here, we focused very much on the customer metrics. In this last piece here, I'm not really sure what's going to roll out, but the one thing that I find really interesting, in James McQuivey's book, he talks about a 12-year-old whose name is Thomas Suarez, who actually did a presentation on the TED Talks a couple of years ago, which was downloaded 2 million times within a very short period of time. And basically this kid, 12-year-old kid, got his parents to pay the $99 that were required for him to post an app that he had created on the App Store. And the app was called Earth Fortune. And basically Earth Fortune was just a very childish manifestation of a sort of a fortune-telling thing. So you put in certain variables and it gave you feedback about your character or about your future or about whatever. The point of it was that he could sell this app for let's say 50 American cents. If he sold 2 million of those, having paid his $99, that's him pretty much a millionaire. So at age 12, the thing that he has demonstrated, which we can't cope with as organizations, is we have all these systems in place which are linear and sequential and thoughtful and customer-centric, as in they start with the customer's point of view. And here you have a 12-year-old kid who sits behind his computer at home, has access to the internet, has had his parents pay the $99 that are required to access iTunes, and what he's able to do is to create an app and in a completely fearless environment, put that out into the market, and if customers love it, he'll make a fortune, and if they hate it, he doesn't worry because he'll just get on and build the next one. So the cycle time between the conceptualization of the idea and actually putting it into the market and testing it has completely transformed. And the way around this, the causality between ask your customers and then build the product after that versus create the product and then just put it into the market and see if there's take up, and if there isn't, your threshold for failure is incredibly high if you're 12 and you're spending that amount of money. So these are the kind of things which are a major challenge for organizations who are fitting into a traditional sustaining mode of operation, those kind of disruptions, the way in which innovation is done. So this is about changes in customer perspective. This is about changes in the way we innovate from the inside out.